And I'm Christian Astran, campus ministry programmer and theology faculty member at Loyola High School of Los Angeles. And I'm joined today by Father Timothy Clancy, an associate professor of philosophy at Gonzaga University and the former director of the honors program, of which I am an alumni up at Gonzaga. So, Father Clancy, if you want to say a few words about yourself before we jump into our conversation.
Yeah, so in the last 15 years or so, my research and teaching interests have focused on kind of the intersection of philosophy of religion and philosophy of technology, and with a specific interest in this new, what I call virtual world epic that we're entering into. And by virtual, I mean computer-enabled communication, computer-enabled technologies. I think this is or at least I'm exploring the thesis that this virtual age is of the same order of significance as the invention of writing.
Right. And entirely
speech. Yeah.
Right.
So it's a huge, epic change.
Right. So basically, in other words, a fundamental shift in how we think and communicate as people and as society on the
and
whole.
How we understand ourselves.
Right.
And how we understand God and our relationship to the world.
Right. I know there's some fascinating stuff around maybe some more advanced concepts of network ontology and some really fascinating horizons. But I think maybe it's helpful for people who don't spend all their time geeking out about a lot of this stuff to just start with the simple statement of as someone who is obviously a part of the Society of Jesus and has been doing ministry for a long time, what do you think the significance of our current historical moment is as you reflect on, some of this virtual presence in a spiritual manner?
Well, I think this is accelerating the move into virtual life. The COVID-19 epidemic has required us to separate physically from one another. And so all of our communication has to be electronically mediated at this point. And so people are learning how to do that online, how to do it through Zoom, but as well the social media, all the social media channels,
right,
and YouTube, and there has been, particularly among theologians, there has been an instinct to kind of wholesale criticize or be skeptical of life online. That this is inevitably a shallow form of life. It's no substitute for face-to-face interaction. And there's the worry that life online is going to crowd out reading,
right,
so literate culture,
right,
but also crowd out even face-to-face relationships. And in religious terms, that would mean crowding out communal gatherings and moving toward virtual church services or prayer apps without that face-to-face personal component. I mean, that seems to be the big worry.
Right. And that's fascinating to think about now that our present moment with COVID-19 has kind of forced us to almost throw that aside because we don't have any other choice to do it.
There's a number of articles in like the New York Times and Washington Post, which are the two papers I read, talking about how a lot of these social media critics are having to backpedal right now because screen time is probably the highest quality time people have right now.
Right.
And so the idea of, well, you really need to restrict people's screen time, like kids, restrict children's screen time for fear of what it's doing to their brains and all this kind of stuff. It's like, we got to put that on hold.
Right.
So what we have is a great experiment in just what can be done online. And people are learning that actually you can have some pretty rich relationships mediated through screens. That if it isn't just being used for trivial purposes, people can see what you can do online that's actually rich and meaningful and challenging.
Right. I even think that things like this conversation are a great example of, extending these really meaningful and important conversations that a lot of the times we want to save until we're in person or create events around, and that instead it can kind of take on a new life of its own, because in many ways, recording a conversation like this allows us to make it a permanent object, a tangible object of living on past just the conversation that we're having in the immediate present. And I think that's a great aspect of what we're doing as well for a lot of people.
And I agree that online life should not replace face-to-face interaction and shouldn't replace reading and writing. But when we learned how to write, we didn't stop talking, right? We just had more to talk about because we were reading books.
Right.
And I think I think if used properly, right, if used prudently, life online can, again, enrich and supplement literate life, so reading and writing, and also face-to-face communication, because as is now evident over social media can really sustain a relationship where you can only meet occasionally face-to-face, but you can keep that relationship going, whereas in the past it might have kind of dissipated because you weren't actually encountering one another very often. Right. So right now we have kind of a bizarre situation where online is a substitute for face-to-face, but hopefully we'll learn how to use this medium over these weeks and months so that when we go back to face-to-face, we can still use some of the best of what we've learned.
I would absolutely agree with that. And I think, for me, one of the coolest things, thinking about what you're talking about in terms of the move from oral culture and storytelling into the writing phase, and then thinking about kind of the new axial age we find ourselves in. For me, I think, just in terms of my own reflection, that I think storytelling has really been enhanced and re-brought back as a way of cultural norm for a lot of people through social media, because now people are seeing and hearing stories, whereas before they could read someone's account, but instead they're gaining this really rich context for stories that before might have lacked that deeper, meaning, and it's kind of putting a face to the words in a lot of ways that we were missing before, I think, in some mediums of just text only.
Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah. The virtual can remediate some of the impoverishment of writing, because while writing can preserve oral communication over time and you can communicate across distance, you're still losing the sound.
Right.
And the virtual brings the sound back. So it's a richer form of communication in that sense, that it's multi-sensory. It's not just visuals, it's also sound. And maybe soon enough, haptic, touch is beginning to get in there.
Well, I think it's really fascinating. Just this last week, I was listening to NPR, and they did a graduation in Japan using tablets and robots, and the students were present on a tablet, and they did an in-person graduation with students controlling a robot to receive their diploma. And that was
holy cow.
that was their way of, making it an in-person celebration, was finding a way to mend the virtual with the in-person. So I think that these ideas, because of what's going on, are becoming more and more of a practical experiment in human experience.
Yeah, if you want to look 20 years into the future, just go to Japan.
Yeah. I would agree with that statement in a lot of ways. Now, kind of to steer our conversation into a deeper place of Ignatian, I think, contemplation and background. What are there any Ignatian terms or ideas that you feel like are really present in this new area of virtual experience that a lot of us are being forced into right now?
Well, I think the finding God in all things is really important. So again, if there are like liturgists and ministers who are very skeptical about bringing ritual online, bringing prayer services online, or bringing the Mass online. Very skeptical that loss of physical contact, that loss of just face-to-face bodies in a place where emotion can be contagious and you can have a powerful experience, a personal, powerful experience, that the loss of that really impoverishes ritual to the extent that maybe you can't have religious ritual online.
Right.
But again, this is an opportunity for us to experiment on what could be done online and what ways of ritual might work. I think in general, the question can't be whether we can find the sacred online or create a sacred space online. Because as people spend more and more of their lives online, if the sacred can't be found online, then these people are godless, right?
No,
they're living
true.
A godless life if the sacred is not part of that life. So we can't just abdicate. Religion can't just abdicate the virtual realm, right?
No, I think
the question has to be not whether, but how. How do we bring the sacred online?
Right, and I think one of the beautiful things looking at the Ignatian pedagogical approach is that it's about taking the best of something that's new, taking the best of a new culture or environment, and meshing that with what works from the old, right? And it's that way of crossing over into a new sphere. And I think that really that's the challenge you're describing, or at least what I'm hearing for all of us right now, is finding ways to mesh those horizons of the things we did in face-to-face, ritual, thinking of a Mass, taking the best of the face-to-face aspects of the Mass and trying to find a way to impart that grace to people somehow through a screen in our current moment.
Well, let me talk about the Mass, because I'm a pastor of a parish outside of town, and we're having a prayer service when we would have the Mass, right? We're a small parish, so we just have one Mass on Sundays at 9 a.m. So we have a 9 a.m. prayer service over a Zoom chat, right? And we get maybe 45 to 50 people, right? Now, I'm kind of skeptical about taking a ritual that's designed for one medium and just translating it into another medium. So to me, video streaming a Mass is kind of like thinking of a film as videoing a stage play.
Right.
Right. You're not using the advantages of the medium. Film enables you to edit, and it enables you to have multiple settings.
Right.
And film enables you to have people speak very, very softly, which an audience wouldn't hear, right? It enables you to have close-ups, right? So similarly, I think a successful virtual ritual is going to be a ritual that draws on the features and the qualities of that medium. So for example, how do you have a interactive prayer service online? Well, the prayer is a petition that can be opened up to everybody, and everybody can see everybody's faces on the screen, and then people can contribute their own prayer, and we pray together. So that's a part of a ritual that can be interactive. So I kept that part of the Mass, and I kept at least one reading and the gospel for the Mass. I don't think talking heads work very well on TV or online,
right.
like
That's
this,
true.
I guess.
Yeah, that's true.
But so I kept my music group wanted to sing songs over Zoom, and I thought, I can't see how that's going to work. I don't think we're smart enough to coordinate people playing different instruments in different places and the sound all coming together over Zoom. So I thought, let's take advantage of this to use really high quality YouTube sacramental songs,
right.
video songs, right? Using music that we couldn't possibly perform ourselves, right? Because we're not professional musicians, right? So, and that would have like video in the back or beautiful pictures to go with the singing, right? And so that's what we do. We start with a YouTube music video on some sacred music. And then I give an opening prayer, and then different people read readings. And then I give a little reflection. And then we have this shared prayers of petition. Now, for Good Friday, tomorrow, I'm preparing tomorrow's liturgy. I found a beautiful, reasonably somber but beautiful performance of, I think it's Dan Schutte, but I think it's one of their St. Louis Jesuits, singing "Behold, Behold the Way of the Cross," with this background of crosses and a forest. I mean, it's just beautiful, right? So we're going to start with that music video, right, to kind of set the mood, and then have an opening prayer, and then have some readings. And then rather than read the Passion, which seems like an awful long thing to read online, if it isn't like a live performance, we're going to do the way of the cross.
Okay.
And we're going to do it with the PowerPoint slides of the different stations. So I found a really nice artistic set of the way of the cross, and I just have one frame for each PowerPoint slide. And so we bring up the picture, and then my deacon says the first part of the prayer, and I say the second part of the prayer, and then we move to the second station. So instead of reading the Passion, we're doing the way of the cross, which I think works better online. And then we're not going to do the Eucharist, and we're not going to do communion, of course. But instead of that, we'll say an Our Father together, and close it off. So I guess what's controversial is I'm not doing the Eucharist. And part of that is from having these arguments with people who are worried that online prayer is going to replace the Mass. And my response has always been, you don't want to do the Mass online. You want to do other rituals online, new rituals online, that would not substitute for the Mass, but that would supplement, like daily readings on an app, with meditative music, something you can do the other 6 days of the week when you're not in church at Mass, right?
That's right.
And so when it's like, okay, now we can't do the Mass in person. If we're going to do the Mass, we're going to have to do it online. I'm thinking, well, I just argued about why you shouldn't do the Mass online, so I don't want to kind of retract that. I'd like to experiment with different kinds of liturgies and see if we can find what works online, what you can do in the virtual space to create a sacred moment and a sacred experience for people.
Right. Well, and I think going back to, what we're talking about in terms of kind of the essence of liturgy and the essence of prayer itself is the dynamic interplay of people interacting with each other. Right.
And that's what's tricky to do online.
Right. And I think the real challenge is in terms of looking towards a digital or virtual way of engagement is really trying to find new ways. And like you said, we just have to learn by experimenting. We have to be willing to, I think in a lot of ways, be willing to fail and see how things go and know that it's not going to be perfect all the time for a while as we try and learn new ways of embracing connection with one another.
Now, all that said, we are going to do a Mass on Easter Sunday. So we'll try our best to see what we can do with the Mass. But we have all these other kinds of prayers that we've experimented with too. And I mean, I'd like to have one Sunday be the Rosary, and see how you could do that online in a way that could, because I think that could be fairly participative if you share out the responsibility for leading the prayers.
Right. Absolutely. Right. And it also is helpful. One thing that strikes me in the way you're describing is it presents a way to kind of open up liturgy to people that normally wouldn't get to be involved in planning or coordinating or even executing those kinds of things. It opens up participation in the ritual for really everyone. It's almost like a democratizing of the Mass in many ways.
Yeah, that's very good. Yeah.
And so, I think there's a lot of these thoughts and a lot of the things that strikes me that we're talking about is that it just takes a willingness, I think, to, in many ways, not just destigmatize, but also reopen ourselves to an imagination of what liturgy and spirituality looks like for people, given our context. And I really like the word you put of it's supplementing. We are adding to our own tradition rather than trying to take something away. And I think that's a fear of a lot of people when we think about a lot of this right now.
Well, the first uses of the internet, kind of the killer apps for the internet, was commerce, video games, porn, right? None of which are very sacred sounding.
No. Not at all.
Not at all. So I think thinking about what you could do online kind of suffers from those being kind of the lead associations with online, with being on the internet. So I'm hoping that this time will actually help us to become more familiar and make the internet more a part of our everyday life, kind of normalize being online, because I'm confident that when this is over, the things that worked well, we're going to keep doing.
Absolutely. And I think it opens the door to build new types of communities too.
Absolutely.
Right. And I think that's, even for me with my students, we're building new spaces of community that we hadn't thought of before. And we've had to try new ways of embracing one another that for our community we took for granted, and that in many ways we didn't think were necessary because we assumed that our face-to-face contact was a given every single day. And so,
that's very good.
Yeah, I think that's great. Just one last area I think that might be helpful to shift over into is, I think you and I have had some other conversations about digital natives and digital immigrants.
Right.
And kind of that blurred distinction between, for younger people, that there's kind of a given level of indoctrination, or I guess that's a rough word, enculturation of technology. Yeah, enculturation. Enculturation of technology and digital presence just being a way of life for a lot of young people, in particular Generation Z and some millennials. And then digital immigrants really being those that didn't see online presence as a necessity for life.
It didn't exist most of our lives.
Exactly. And I think what's really great about this is that I've seen a lot of those previous barriers that prevented some of these conversations from happening have been removed, because now everyone is kind of in a situation where we're being forced into an online presence as a part of our everyday existence for a lot of people that didn't have to do that before.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and I think that hopefully, you've talked about, and I know that the stigma is real for a lot of people of embracing spirituality in new forms can seem really scary in a lot of ways, and I think that we're in a present moment that is going to help a lot of people embrace a new type of spirituality for a new way of proceeding in the world that is only going to become more and more dynamic because we won't be limited to Zoom always. And I think that that's a fun part of these types of thought experiments for a lot of people is thinking about what we do now can have a profound effect on where our faith can go in the future.
Yes, absolutely.
So I think we're almost at half an hour here and wrapping up our thoughts. Any closing thoughts you would want to offer on what's going on, our present moment?
Boy, I wish I had something really profound to close out with. But let me see. Well, Jesus was an oral prophet, right? I'm not confident that he could read and write, right? He certainly didn't write anything down that we have.
Right.
But his immediate disciples thought it should get written down. So why didn't Jesus write it down? I think he didn't write it down because he didn't know how to write. And he could read scripture in the temple, but he already knew what he was reading. He had heard these stories over and over and over. And so I think the words on the page were more of a mnemonic device than they were reading. I don't think he could have picked up Aristotle and started to read, right? At least, how could he? I mean, there's no reason to think he could, given the socioeconomic class he came from, and given that at that time, it took your whole young adult life to learn how to read and write.
Right.
I mean, this was and only scribes would do this. And that was a very small elite in the ancient world. So Jesus, as a carpenter or a construction worker or kind of a day laborer, really, there's no reason to think he could read or write. But immediately, followers of his within a couple of generations took what Jesus had taught, took the gospel, and put it in a literary form. And thought about, well, what are the implications of what Jesus is doing and saying, and put it in the context of literate ways of thought, literate conceptual systems like Greek philosophy, right? Well, I think today, as I think we're getting a new kind of self-understanding, a new way of thinking of the world as information, and that we're going to need to once again translate the gospel into virtual categories, which doesn't mean that we throw away the oral gospel or throw away literate theology, but we're going to need to add what I'm calling virtual theology to kind of put the doctrines of the church translate things into literate categories. So a couple examples of this would be like thinking of Jesus, thinking of our world as God's virtual world. And that we depend on God a lot like our virtual worlds depend on the power of our machines and our designing and our writing the code, right?
Right, absolutely.
I mean, it's a really nice analogy in that we're not just talking about God starting things off and then leaving them go, any more than you can create a game, but then never have to upload it anywhere, or never have to keep the power on, right? Or never have to moderate the game, right? So that God would be kind of like the moderator of this video game, which is life, you know?
Right, absolutely.
and then think of Jesus maybe as God's avatar in the game. And so, I mean, it requires a lot of reflection. It took 500 years for the church to come to consensus on how we should translate the oral gospel into literate categories before we got all those dogmas figured out. So I think it's probably going to take us several generations to figure out what's the richest way of understanding the truths of the gospel in this new language and this new world we're living in. But we got to start sometime, and we can't wait. We got to start. But it's all very experimental at this point, just like the rituals, right? There's no past to rely on. We're making the past. We're making the tradition.
That's right. And I think for me, one of the fun parts as someone who is in ministry is that knowing that the things that I come up with now, I'm going to have to radically change in the future, because the medium that I'm using, whether it's Zoom or Skype, and the tools at our disposal are constantly being updated and changed in a way. The rate of acceleration of access to things is so dramatically changing. Just thinking about, the technology that was available in, the early 2000s or the late 90s, 20 years later in 2020 is such a dramatic range of difference. I think if this had happened 20 years ago, for someone to say, hey, students in Japan are going to control robots to receive their diplomas. The fact that that's a news story in 2020 and normal, I think reflects that the experimentation that we're going through with ritual is also just a reflection that the tools at our disposal are constantly changing as well, and that's part of the whole process that we're going through.
Well, you took my the philosophy of technology class for the honors program with I was team teaching it with a couple other guys, and my estimate is that about 75% of that class is about technologies that didn't exist when we started the class 15 years ago.
That's what I think that's
which is pre-Facebook. It's pre-Facebook, let alone smartphones, let alone CRISPR, let alone the Internet of Things, let alone big data. I mean, it's just a cascade of technologies that didn't exist 15 years ago.
And I think it's something that we're all on the ride together with about. A couple of plugs to put in at the end of our video here. Please feel free to check out an Ignatian way of embracing technology at the Digital Ignatian site, and also check out www.religiostech.org, which Father Clancy is running, for a very smart and academic take on virtual ontology, a philosophy of religion, and really a virtual way of practicing sacramentality online. I think there are things that are being explored there and done, if I may say so, from at least his students' perspective, done very well and done in a way that is informative as I'm trying to develop my own ministerial praxis in the world.
And orthodox.
That's right, and orthodox, and approved by the Jesuit University of Gonzaga. That's important to put out there. So again, Father Clancy, I just want to thank you for taking some of your time out of your day. As you talked about, you're an active minister trying to plan Holy Week celebrations. So thanks for being here, and thanks for taking some time to share some of your insights and some of your spirituality with us as we share this out to the world.